Okay, we are on time. We're going to begin with the webinar. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the last DRR and Gender webinar, Gender Impact Analysis, highlighting and connecting the proper dots in your reports to articulate your efforts with the main environment, DRR, and development agendas. My name is Almudena Montoliu. I'm the DPECO Caribbean Coordinator from UNDP Regional Hub. And this series of webinars are part of the Strengthen Integrated and Cohesive Preparedness Capacity at the regional, national, and community level in the Caribbean project that supports concrete actions for an effective early warning system, as well as aims to improve information management and operational capacity to improve the disaster preparedness mechanism for the Caribbean regional response. Working with Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, the Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines and Cuba at a national and community level, and with regional early warning and response actors at the Caribbean level, UNDP, CDEMA, OCHA, and IFRC with eco-financing have spent 3 years in a partnership to reduce the risk of disaster in the region. As part of the efforts to strengthen the gender dimension of the project, UNDP Regional Hub, through the coordination of the project and with the gender cluster and the OCHA, UNDP Barbados Office, UNDRR, and Inclusive Growth and SDG Integration Program of UNDP Regional Hub collaboration, are organizing the webinar series. These webinar series have been designed as a knowledge-sharing tool to facilitate Chinese practical knowledge and best practices to ensure that gender considerations are identified and addressed when strengthening preparedness capacity at the regional, national, and community level. The webinar series are composed of 3 webinars that build upon each other and provide guidance how to effectively mainstream gender in all stages related to disaster preparedness, from data collection and analysis to final impact analysis. The final webinar is going to be focused on how to conduct an impact analysis of mainstreaming gender and how to report on this finds and articulated with the main environment, DRR, and development agendas. Let me introduce you Andrea Quesada, Gender Focal Point of the DPECO Caribbean Project, and member of the Gender Cluster of UNDP Regional Hub, who will be in charge of guiding the discussion with colleagues from UNDRR and UNDP. Andrea, good morning, and go ahead, please.
Good morning, Almudena, and thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of the participants for joining us today. We are quite excited to have our last webinar of this very interesting series. Just so we can recap what this journey has been, let me remind you that, as Almudena was saying, we had 2 previous webinars in which we discussed different issues. We started off with the importance of sex and age disaggregated data and how we collect it. On our second webinar, we had a fantastic as well presentation by one of our colleagues from the Office of Barbados, Sherissa Dodges. He was presenting us how to conduct gender analysis with this type of data and the importance of doing it as well. And today we do have a fabulous third webinar where we are going to explore the last step. As teams working on disaster risk reduction or working on several other issues, how do we, as the title says, connect the dots and report on the different efforts that we are doing to promote gender equality and women's empowerment? And today's webinar is going to be a reflection on how you do it, what you can report on, and again, why is it so important that we really start highlighting these efforts and showing that it is possible to design and implement disaster risk reduction programs or projects with a gender perspective, or even better, those that are gender responsive and have specific goals. So today, to be able to take us into this journey, we have three fantastic presenters that have very different perspectives and that are going to share us their experiences working on different issues that somehow connect to the main topics of today. So just as a reminder before I present them, today's webinar is going to be a dialogue. It is a conversation between experts, and we do invite participants to write their questions as we are speaking. And at the end, we will be able to address them and have a little bit more detail regarding your questions. So we do encourage you to interact with us as well. And as I was saying, today's objective is going to be able to provide some recommendations on how we can document and report the contributions to gender equality and women's empowerment, and comply as well with different mandates that we have in different agendas: the environmental agenda, the disaster risk reduction agenda, and the development agenda, particularly Agenda 2030. So we have a conversation that is going to describe, first of all, some of these mandates, so we're all on the same page. Then we're going to share some best practices on how you can harmonize these so you don't feel that overwhelmed, and then identify some key gender elements that should be included in the reports, and that we would really like to see reports pushing themselves and teams pushing themselves to be able to include this information, and as well start thinking of the impact that including these actions has had on the project and in the results of the projects. So as I said, it is going to be a conversation, a 40 to 45-minute conversation with these three fantastic experts. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce you Mr. Ivan González de Alba. He is the Regional Advisor for Poverty Reduction and Sustainable Development at UNDP. We also have our colleague Marta Álvarez. She's also a specialist on sustainable development for UNDP, with also a lot of experience working on gender issues. And Ms. Maria Contro, she is a disaster risk reduction advisor for the Caribbean for UNDDR. So as you will see, we do have three very different perspectives, and I would like to have a brief introduction or let our presenters introduce themselves briefly so they could share their experiences before we start our questions. Maybe we can start with Ivan.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. I hope everything is fine with you. We are here working from home and very excited about this webinar. To be honest, I don't have a lot of experience in this specific, but as I mentioned to Andrea and Almudena and the organizers of this webinar, probably having a broader picture can help us to think about other ways as well. So very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. Marta?
Hi, good morning to everyone. My name is Marta, and I work with Ivan at the Regional Hub in the Inclusive Growth and SDG Integration team. Well, before that, I used to work for UN Women on humanitarian action and peace and security, but my work was more focused on advocacy and policy advice. Yeah. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Ivan and Marta. It is, as I said, a true honor to have you both. And last but not least, Maria.
Hello, good morning. My name is Maria Contro. I'm a disaster risk reduction advisor for the Caribbean region at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, previously known as UNISDR. So that is for the regional office for the Americas and the Caribbean. I've been working over 10 years with matters related to disaster risk reduction and on gender in disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction in general is a very essential part of enabling sustainable development, and gender integration in that is essential because it can significantly improve the results of disaster risk reduction, among other very, very important matters as well, and not only disaster risk reduction but of the sustainable development. So I'm very happy to be here to discuss these important matters.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I think that reflection, that what you have just said about the importance of the gender dimension of disaster risk reduction is the key, take-home message and element that we thought that these webinars could supply to or contribute to. And to be able to do so, this is why we were thinking of a practical way of being able to share experiences and to be able to have more of this interactive and pragmatic series of recommendations. So to start off with, I think that because we all come from different areas of work, we all have different knowledge and different capacities as well in terms of how we work. I think that the first question that we really want our experts to ask is to let us know, what is the status quo? What are or how do the main environment, disaster risk reduction and development agendas address gender equality? And what are these key mandates included in these agendas? Because without understanding what we're supposed to report on, it's very hard to report it on. So it's a little bit of a situation of a chicken and an egg. And in this case, let us start with that, understanding what does the international agenda look like regarding gender. So Ivan, maybe you can start us off with more of a general perspective, and then we will go to then Maria, that will give us the disaster risk reduction nuances.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, let me start by mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals. That is a key part of this 2030 development agenda. And we probably all know about the SDGs, the three pillars of the SDGs, the economic, environment, and social pillars, and the 17. We have heard about the 17 goals and all the targets, etc. But in the SDGs, what we have about gender is goal number 5, that refers specifically to gender equality. This goal number 5 has 9 targets, and 3 of them are about implementations in topics like equal rights, enabling technology, and information and sound policies and legislation. But the gender equality is not only contained in this 5th goal in the SDGs, is more a cross-cut topic across all 17 SDGs, and is reflected in about 45 targets and 54 indicators within the SDGs. And let me also mention that the 2030 development agenda is not only comprised by the SDGs, also the Sendai framework that I'm sure Maria is going to talk about more deeply, but also some other agreements or frameworks, like for example the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, and also the new Urban Agenda. So we have a collection of agreements, frameworks, and goals that comprise the 2030 development agenda, and in all of them in all of them we have a specific actions and goals for gender equality.
So we do have a lot of gender mandates, and as you were saying, they're growing and moving into areas that we traditionally haven't thought that have a link with gender equality. So I think it is a quite exciting time as well that we are seeing these links that in many occasions the teams working on the ground see them, but that the fact that the international agendas are also recognizing, I think also allows these teams to be able to connect more easily these dots. Maria, can you enlighten us with some of the nuances and details related to the disaster risk reduction agenda and how it addresses gender?
Yes, definitely. So the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is a framework from 2015 to 2030, and it was developed in consultation with different regions at the local level, national level, regional level, international level, in order to gather the best practices and use those in a way that it can benefit defining these key points, what really works in disaster risk reduction, what really brings the best results. So this was a framework that was agreed together with the countries, and it recognizes the different role of the different groups and identifies women, for example, as important actors in delivering these results. Overall, the Sendai framework focuses on 4 priorities, which are risk knowledge, risk management, risk financing, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and build back better in recovery. It focuses on several different areas how gender can be addressed in these priorities. For example, it states that gender, age, disability, and cultural perspective should be integrated in all policies and practices, and women and youth leadership should be promoted in disaster risk reduction. It also says that women and their participation is critical to effectively manage disaster risk and designing, resourcing, and implementing gender-sensitive disaster risk reduction policies, plans, and programs. As well as that empowering women and persons with disabilities to publicly lead and promote gender equitable and universally accessible response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction approaches is key in these disaster risk reduction activities. So it clearly recognizes the importance of gender in the various aspects and priorities of disaster risk reduction, which tells us that as this was defined together based on the best experiences, what seems to be working in many regions, in many countries, that this is really a key aspect for results and development.
Thank you, Maria. And I think that point that you have just made, that last point, is extremely important, because I think that we have also seen an evolution of these mandates. We have seen an evolution how as well we are addressing gender in these agendas. As Ivan was mentioning, we have the Agenda 2030. Well, if we look at the ODS, the previous set of goals that we had, these goals also had gender equality as a separate one, but it wasn't mainstream in other ones. And we, with the Agenda 2030, start seeing gender being taken into account in all of these different areas as a key element of development, as you were saying. And the disaster risk reduction as well agenda has also seen, I think, that evolution from the Hyogo to the Sendai framework where we start seeing gender not only being recognized as a key mainstreaming, as a key, cross-cutting issue, but also providing some very good guidance of how we start to address gender. So as a summary, I think to answer this question, we start off with a very detailed set of mandates. And it is a very exciting time because they can be seen as a very unique guidance. However, speaking to some of the teams, we sometimes find them as well overwhelming. So that leads me to my next question to our presenters. Can these mandates then be harmonized somehow? Can you somehow manage to look at this universe where gender equality is recognized and where we should be addressing gender considerations on multiple topics and on multiple levels? And can projects comply with several of them at the same time? Ivan, you want to start us off, or Maria?
Well,
yes.
Maybe I would also like to hear what Marta has to say about the first question. But then regarding this one, let me just say something that because you mentioned the MDGs. The previous development agenda before the SDGs. And there are quite some differences between these two development agendas that are very important, not only in terms of gender, but also for disaster risk reduction. And just to have it as a framework, let me just remind three of those differences, and based on the principles. One was already mentioned, the integration principle, that you have the three pillars of sustainable development: social, economic, and environmental. But then also the principle of universality. The previous development agenda was one for developing countries, and this one, the new development agenda, is not a developing countries. Not only for developing countries, it's for the whole world. So this is what the principle of universality means, that we all have something to do. We all have a responsibility. And not only governments, also private sector, academia, civil society, etc. So this is a principle that is important to keep in mind when we think about gender and disaster risk reduction. And then the other one is the leave no one behind principle, that the idea is to go beyond averages. One of the criticisms from the previous development agenda is it was too focused on averages. So as long as countries met on average their goals, then it was fine. And this is no longer the case for this development agenda. We need to see that everyone is involved in progress and in development, and for that we need to be very precise and have what they call this data revolution. And this principle is very important because so far, even though we have gone far in terms of the new development agenda, only 10 of the 54 gender-specific indicators are produced with regularity and classified as Tier 1. So there is still a lot of work to do in terms of gender mainstreaming and that data gathering, and after that in terms of the capability to analyze that data and so on. No?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point, because even though we have evolved, even in the multilateral environmental agreements, there's still these gaps. We still need to think, as you were saying, in a more harmonized way. Marta, do you want to contribute to the answers of the first two questions? How do you see
yes.
that? that we can harmonize these mandates? How do you see that projects can integrate them, for example, in or how can they comply with several of them as well?
Oh, yes, I think that all these mandates are complementary and each of them are very necessary as part of a project. As Ivan and Maria commented, in addition to the 2030 agenda, there are other international frameworks that can be considered when designing a project. And well, they mentioned the 2030 agenda and the Sendai framework, but it's important to also consider the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, as is considered as the most progressive plan that has ever existed to promote the rights of women. And this international action plan has several links with disasters. For example, the Beijing Declaration calls for the recognition of the role of women in the prevention of disasters and reminds that many women are particularly affected by environmental disasters. And well, as a reflection, I would like to say that gender inequalities manifest in each and every dimension of sustainable development. I will provide another example. While girls are doing increasingly better in school and university than boys, this has not translated into gender equality in the labor market. The gender pay gap stands at 23% globally, and without decisive action, it will take another 68 years to achieve equal pay. Well, regarding the complementarity of mandates, we understand that not all staff have this specific knowledge in every international framework, but it's important to seek for expertise outside the team when necessary. So yeah, that's all from
Thank you, Marta, and thank you for reminding us of Beijing, particularly this year that it's the 25th anniversary of Beijing. I also would like to remind everybody that we do have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's acronym CEDAW. Also gives us this guidance of how to be able to assure that women can have the same rights as men. And if you read CEDAW with your disaster risk reduction lenses or your environmental lenses or your biodiversity lenses, you will see that it still holds for today. So what you were saying, Marta, is very important, that we need to first, as teams, start to understand what are these mandates, what are they saying? And then once you understand it as a team, you can then interpret them for your own project. And once you've interpreted, that allows you to identify these key gender considerations that you could address through the project and as well then later on report. Maria, do you have anything you would like to add as well?
Yes, on the harmonized approach, definitely the mandates can and should be harmonized with project and program work. And this indeed is the purpose of these agendas as well, to be translated into practical level. And as mentioned by the colleagues from UNDP, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework, they are complementary. They are harmonized among each other as well, working towards the same 2030 agenda. And then how to integrate it into the programs? There are several reasons why to integrate gender is the cost benefits, the result perspective, getting improved results with gender considerations with same amount of work. So the cost benefits is very good, and gender addresses the gender perspective seeks to address the most vulnerable ones, and therefore if you can improve the situation of the most vulnerable ones, you can then improve also the results. So if we look at the specific targets of the Sendai framework, I would like to speak a little bit about those and how that can translate, to give some ideas how that can translate in program and project work. So there are 7 practical targets in the Sendai framework that we aim towards 2030. The first 3 if you look at them from the perspective of gender disaggregated data, so the first one is to reduce global disaster mortality. The second one is to reduce the number of affected people by disasters, and the third one is to reduce direct disaster economic loss that occur due to disasters. So if you have on those 3 targets, if you have gender disaggregated data, that is the first step. You can then see what is the difference of genders, or if you disaggregate the data even further with the different social groups, you can see really which groups are the most affected ones, which ones have higher mortality, which ones are more affected, where are the economic losses to who are those economic losses falling towards, so we can then see what is happening, and therefore we can better target actions and therefore get these results that we've been speaking about. The fourth target is to reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. So here we could look critical infrastructure, critical to who? Who are the users of this infrastructure? Because if you look at gender and age, then you can look, for example, in critical infrastructure, you can look at schools or hospitals, and schools have a very specific population group that are using them. And usually infrastructure and basic services do tend to have this kind of specific characteristics of who are the users, and then you have to look who are being attended to, whose needs are being attended to, are there any prioritization based on what, is there enough analysis to do a proper prioritization of establishing critical infrastructure and basic services in order to best target the needs. Then the fifth target is to increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. And the sixth one is to enhance international cooperation to developing countries through sustainable support. So these two targets need to look also on the project level how gender is being addressed here in the national disaster risk reduction strategies as well as in the international cooperation. We need to ensure that gender is an integral part and consideration within these plans and cooperation. Then the last one, the seventh target of the Sendai framework, is to substantially increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems. So this speaks about early warning systems, and I want to highlight that it speaks about the access to multi-hazard early warning systems. And there are 4 pillars in early warning systems: risk knowledge, needs gender disaggregated data in order to understand what is happening. The communication of alerts is something that also has a very strong gender focus. How do we communicate? Who are the audiences? How do people receive and interpret these messages? And then the 4th one being the response. Then how do people respond to these alerts? There are differences between population groups. So these are kind of considerations that when you are designing your project or program, that you can look, for example, the Sendai 7 targets, and refer to these targets and see how can this be translated into the project, because these in the end are quite practical.
Mm-hmm. So I think, Maria, thank you for that last summary. I think it's really important, because that led me to my next question, which was what advice would you provide to a team working on disaster risk reduction on how to ensure that their work is complying with these mandates? So maybe if you can recap that, and then we can ask as well our colleagues Ivan and Marta if they have any other advice for teams. How do you start grasping all of these mandates, and how do you start working with gender to ensure that your program or project can take it into account successfully?
Yes, that is a very important aspect. So I actually think that maybe the Sendai 7 considerations quite much answer to that. But I also want to add that gender is not something that we do separately. It's something that we should consider always when we do projects. The project can be, for example, a disaster risk reduction project, but we need to mainstream gender into the disaster risk reduction project in order to have the justice approach, to be able to target the populations that are in the most vulnerable positions, and in order to have the improved results to target actions in a way that they respond to the needs of each specific population group. So my key message here, in addition to the previous conversation, would be that gender applies to everything we do in sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. And hence we should demystify a little bit that we have to be gender experts or just have this very complex, analysis. We have to have gender analysis, but we can then just move forward as well as projects and start thinking how my project can start addressing, as you were saying, these different issues. Ivan, Marta? Hello?
Yes.
Sorry.
Marta,
Sorry.
you first.
Some advice for teams, because I know we have provided a lot of information and maybe it's a little bit overwhelming. So how do you start tackling it?
Thank you. So, well, in my opinion, I think that it's important to always think that disasters are not gender neutral, and this means that they affect women, girls, boys, and men differently. That gender inequalities increase the vulnerability of women and limit their access to the information and resources that they need to reduce the risks arising from disasters. And well, there are multiple materials from UNDP that can help to mainstream gender during different phases of a project. For instance, as far as I know, we have the guidance note on how to conduct a gender analysis and the gender mainstreaming made easy handbook for program staff. But I'm sure that the gender team can provide more information and guidance on that.
Thank you for that. Yuan?
Yes, thank you. Well, in my case, I guess the most important thing or the departure point is wearing the gender glasses. And let me give you an anecdotal example. When I was working working on this paper on the environmental variables in multidimensional poverty indexes, then the gender team here at the regional hub asked me to let them review the document, and I said yes, but I was actually not sure what could they say about gender in that case. For example, we had identified some of the variables regarding to environmental health, and in that case we had for example, garbage collection or the use of cooking fuels, etc. No? And to me, it was only about disaggregating data by sex, and that was mostly the idea. But then Jessica, the consultant in the gender team who was reviewing that, made me notice that, for example, in the case of cooking fuel, when you're cooking for with wood or charcoal, then those health risks are more prevalent in women, since they are the women who usually cook at home. So and that was something that I didn't notice. It was not obvious for me at the beginning, but once you put the gender glasses and you wear the gender glasses, then you can see that things happen differently to women and men, and that leads you to have a differential approach to things, no? So in my case, that's the departure point for this is to wear your gender glasses, no?
Thank you to our experts, because I think that this advice is key. And to summarize for all of our participants, so the first one would be to learn about your mandates and this different ways that gender has been addressed in the different agendas. The second advice that Evangelist has given us is as well, put your gender lenses on so that you can identify these links between whatever you're working on and what the gender dimension is. Even sometimes in issues that we don't think have a gender dimension, they might have it, as Ivan was mentioning. Then Marta reminded us that it is key to search for tools. There are many different tools that are available that can help you in this process of learning your mandates, of being able to establish the links in many cases, but also on the how-to. How can your project start working on gender? How can your project collect the key sex and age segregated data? How can your project conduct a gender analysis? Then, as well, I think that one of the points that was mentioned by Ivan was to be able to ask for the support sometimes of a gender expert, because this would give you a very different perspective, maybe identify some things that we hadn't been able to identify before. And then Maria was telling us very clearly that we really need to strengthen our capacities as a team to be able to really work with these guidance and with these detailed mandates that we have in order for them to become part of your team's DNA. And once you have at least these 5 key steps, then I think the work on gender will show or reveal itself, and then it would be easier to integrate it in the project. And then it would be easier as well to report on it, because I think reflecting from the beginning how you can do it, it will then lead you to how you can report on it. And that leads me to my next question for our guests would be, what would be the key elements then? Once you have gone through this process, once you do your project, you have successfully integrated gender considerations, you have monitored them, but what would be then the key elements that you would include in the reports? And then my question to the 3 of you is, what does an ideal report look like to you? And just as a follow-up, if it's not possible to do an ideal report, like we always are in that situation, what is the minimum gender reporting that you would expect? Maybe this time we can start with Ivan, then Marta, and then Maria.
Okay, this is kind of, because programs and projects sometimes are like followed a cycle, as well as public policies. Public policies are also in cycles. And we usually start by the definition of the problem, and then we create, sometimes we create a theory of change, and then we move through the implementation, and then at the end we have the monitoring and evaluation and all that. So if we think about that cycle, then the idea for me is the reporting should be able to answer some of the questions regarding the gender mainstreaming, no? For example, how women got involved through the cycle of the project. Were they part of the definition of the problem? Were they involved in the elaboration of the theory of change? What was the role in the implementation phase? Also, for example, how women participated in the process of gathering information, and even before that, in the decision of what information should be gathered. Did women help to analyze this information as well? And then finally, on how do we present the information? Is it disaggregated by sex? But not only disaggregated by sex, as I mentioned it before. Sometimes we need to think in other ways. Were we able to reflect, for example, issues that are women-specific or not? And if our recommendations or our conclusions are gender-sensitive, no? Those probably would be some ways of approaching this.
Thank you. I think that's a great overview. Marta?
Yes. Well, in my opinion, agenda reporting must include some of the following issues as a minimum gender reporting. First of all, the relevance of gender issues to project objectives, whether gender was adequately mainstreamed in project design and implementation. Second, effectiveness of the gender action plan of the project and gender-related outcomes, outputs, targets, and indicators in the design and monitoring framework. And another aspect to take into account is the sex disaggregated project results demonstrating reductions in gender disparities against baseline indicators, and well, the last element to consider is the sustainability of project outcomes on gender equality and women's empowerment based on both quantitative data and qualitative impact assessments. Yeah.
Thank you. That
yes,
it's very detailed, and I think that I hope that the teams are writing down this. If not, Marta, I think you can provide us, I think, with this very, very comprehensive list, because I think it would be great for participants to have this kind of cheat sheet. So while you're designing your project, you start taking into account what your project might report on later, so that your experimental design is very robust. Maria?
Yes, I also agree with Ivan on the importance of having information from women to define the priorities and needs for the project. And I definitely agree with these very important points Marta mentioned in including gender in all steps in project cycle management, because that is how we will get the best results and we get the continuity, and we really base the actions on the analysis. So I just want to highlight that the ideal report has sex and age disaggregated data, and that the analysis is based on this data for the implementation.
I think that's very important, because I think that without that key element that we started actually our webinar series with, it is very hard as well to continue reporting. Just as a summary, I think it is really important. I think our three presenters have basically talked about three key dimensions that a project should have. The first one is this recognition aspect, as Ivan and Maria were saying, how that you really need to recognize women not only as a vulnerable group that has particular needs and preferences, but also as an agent of change group that can contribute greatly to this design of actions, and that will ensure as well, because they are involved, that then the project will be more effective, efficient, and sustainable. And then I think that there is this other element related to all of the processes and how we can ensure that the processes are really taking into account these gender considerations. And these processes go, as Marta was highlighting, and Maria as well, from collecting sex disaggregated data all the way to participation, to decision making, to ensuring that everybody has access to information. That's something Maria mentioned before, that any communication that you're doing is gender sensitive as well. And last but not least, when it comes to the actual impacts of the project, the distribution of these benefits sometimes associated to projects and the costs as well associated to the projects, because many of the projects require behavioral changes, require time input, require being able to contribute to the action, that is also done in an equitable manner, that you're thinking about the different characteristics, the different needs that the different group have. And it's important that we are documenting all of these aspects, because a project, and talking about the minimum, can actually start off by just recognizing and including women, as we were discussing, and that's okay. It could then move forward and have equitable processes. And then it can ensure this equitable distribution of benefits and costs as well, and that would be ideal. But a project, and this is a very pragmatical view, in the minimum should, as Ivan and Maria have highlighted, include the women in the design process. So this recognition at least. So I think that with that, I think we have some great advice for teams. Marta is going to provide us some detailed experience. We now would like to ask participants to start posting their questions if they have any. And while doing so, I'm going to ask our presenters our last question, and then we can go into the session, the Q&A session with the participants. So we've talked about all of the mandates. We have concluded that now we have a very detailed and comprehensive guide, international guide. We also have explored that these can be harmonized, that the projects and the programs can comply with several of them. We have also received some very detailed information how teams and projects in our region can start ensuring actions or start including actions that will ensure that you comply and take into account all of these different mandates. We have defined some of the key elements, but then why do all of this? And this is my last question to the presenters before we start with the Q&A session. It's what is the value? What is the value of looking at this gender impact analysis? What is the value of doing gender reporting? And if you can provide some examples of some projects or programs that have successfully done it, and what were the implications for these projects? Maybe we can start with Ivan, then Marta, and then Maria as well. Thanks.
No, please, ladies first.
Ladies first, Marta, then. Why is it so important to do all of this, Marta?
Thank you, Ivan. Very kind of you. So, well, I cannot provide concrete examples of projects because my experience is not related to that. But I will try to answer to the question on the value of the gender analysis and reporting. In my opinion, the gender impact analysis and reporting can be useful to assess the gender mainstreaming at the project level. Both can provide relevant information on what worked, what did not, and their underlying reasons. Also, they can provide lessons learned on how to improve gender mainstreaming in the design of new projects to enhance our contributions to gender equality and women's empowerment.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Ivan?
Yes, well, what I wanted to well, obviously I agree with what Marta was explaining, but in my case, I wanted just to mention briefly on the impact, on the doing this impact analysis. And because I am an economist, so I usually tend to when somebody mentions impact on how on this in the ways we can measure impact on the interventions. For example, in randomized control trials, difference in difference, propensity score matching. So there are different methodologies, but the idea is if we are going to measure the impact of what we are doing, it would be important to assess the impact of that intervention independent of other things. So, for example, if we have let's assume that we have a conditional or a monetary transfer that was given in the context of a disaster, and it was given to heads of family, either men or women. And then we can measure the impact of how the recovery process was faster probably for women than for men. But then what happens with those who didn't receive the monetary transfer, men and women? So it's important not only to have this difference in terms of disaggregated sex, but also in terms of those who didn't receive the intervention. that's more or less the philosophy of all these methodologies to measure impact. So if you're looking for value added in terms of impact in your program or in your project, then probably it's a good idea to think about these elements, no, of how to isolate the proper impact of the intervention and probably some other factors that could be around too.
Thank you, Ivan. I think that is absolutely essential to also take into consideration even before you're designing your project, because again, will allow you then to be able to foresee how you can measure this impact in the best way as well as you are implementing your project. Maria?
Yes, thank you. So in the value aspect, if we look at disaster risk reduction specifically in this field, the vulnerable ones in the society are the ones who suffer the most in case of a disaster. And gender is an important factor in vulnerability. So targeting the most vulnerable ones brings us most results. Reporting, as you mentioned specifically, the reporting also aims towards lessons learned experiences and therefore constant development. So that is one key factor in the gender field and all the other fields as well, that we report and we gather lessons learned experiences, and not only that we document lessons, but we really create this learning aspect that we include these experiences into the next project design. And or when you are designing your project, that you find these lessons learned experiences, so that we can therefore work with the continued development of the field. And I would also, as I work more on the strategy side, so I would of course recommend to refer to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Maria. I think that with that you provide us again the link to where we started, to being able to have this relationship with the legislation and with the mandates that we have. Just as a summary for teams, before I ask the question that Tashi has asked us, just as a summary in what our colleagues were saying, it's really important to remember that if you do address gender equality, and the reason why we report on it, it is so important as well to document it, is because it allows you to, first of all, as Maria was saying, comply with this legislation and with these mandates, the international ones and the national ones as well, because we do have national gender equality policies in most of the cases. But it also has different aspects related to efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability of the projects. As Ivan was saying, it allows you, and addressing gender issues and these mandates allows you to really consider the challenges that could put at risk your initiative, but also, as Ivan was saying, implementing actions that lead us to obtain results that are more effective in terms of disaster risk reduction. And then there are these two, I think, important aspects that we haven't talked a lot about them today, but it's always important to keep them in the back of your head. Finance opportunities. If you do address gender, there might be some opportunities specifically for gender projects or for gender aspects that could complement your projects. Most of our finance nowadays available for either adaptation or disaster risk reduction does have as well very specific gender strategies and mandates. So with that, it's also an opportunity. And last but not least, I think that what Marta was saying is that we really need to start pushing towards this cooperation and innovation. And we really can start, as she was saying, harmonizing all of these different mandates and start innovating based on what they're saying, based on these lessons learned and experiences. So I think that our presenters have built a very solid 4-pillar table for us to convince ourselves why is it so important to work on gender and then report on it. We do have a question from Tashi. So the question is, when conducting a disaster risk reduction training in the field, how can facilitators consider gender inclusion with certain cultures that may have specific roles for women and men? So more of a practical question. Who would like to answer that? Maria, maybe?
Yes, I've actually been conducting a lot of trainings on gender in early warning system, gender in disaster risk reduction, and this is a very good question and very important topic. So one option is to approach, like, if gender considerations in a certain culture are not really seen something that should be addressed in a way that women and men would have the same responsibilities, then you can look at it from results perspective, because the fact is that when gender has been integrated in disaster risk reduction actions, it provides better results. And when you look at how it provides these results, it's actually quite clear and easy to explain and also easy to adopt, because there's nothing threatening in that. You base actions on data. So first you collect sex and age disaggregated data, or use the available one, and then you conduct your analysis and the project design based on that. So when it's based on data, it's quite neutral, because you target, for example, the most vulnerable ones. And another important aspect is also that when you conduct trainings, these are an opportunity to discuss with the participants about this topic. How does this project fit to the culture and context, or how does that gender perspective fit into the culture and context?
I think Maria.
I think Maria, we lost her for a second, but I think that
Yes.
what she was saying about the context is really important, because anytime you're doing a training and you have the intersectionality of different social aspects, you have the possibility of discussing it, of addressing it, of highlighting it. And depending on the context that you're working on, my little piece of advice that I think Maria might agree as well is to also reach out to social and gender experts that could help you bring up these issues in a way that you do not create more conflict, or you create or create new inequalities, or even light up or contribute to the existing ones. So there are different ways of doing it. I do know of some of our colleagues that have managed to do it as well, in very complex cultural contexts as well, even in the Middle East, or with some indigenous groups that have very specific social structures. And it's a matter of finding the right time and the right way of discussing these. Ivan, you want to complement, or Marta, would you like to complement something before we finish off?
Yes, well, just a brief mention on this question, that because I think this is very relevant. I mean, sometimes it's really hard to work on on the roles for women and men in specific contexts, and sometimes that tends to get attention because people are not used to having women having or participating in certain activities. And but I think probably what Maria was mentioning, and also you, Andrea, is that there is also, well, it's important not to be disruptive. Trainings can be an important element of emancipation. I mean, you can, if you do the right questions, probably you can help people to figure out that some of the cultural roles that for them are normalized are can be different, and and that the situations can change. So I mean, sometimes it's hard because obviously as externals to the community, we have to be careful with what we say, but it's important to be aware that we also we can play this role of helping people to question the right things, no?
As a facilitator. Well, also some colleagues have worked with some members of the community as well that have a different vision. For example, I do have some colleagues, for example, in Honduras, that for a project that was working on a community trying to increase the resilience through their agricultural production, they found some of the men, for example, in the community that were that had a different perspective. And so they become then the gender champions. And so as you were saying, Ivan, they were facilitating a very different conversation that made them reflect, for example, of their own cultural norms, on their own cultural practices in a different way. So there, I think, as a summary, I think that is a context situation and finding the right way to facilitate, as you were saying, this conversation. Well, we do have another comment from Jessica that says, thank you. And do you have some format guide toolboxes and specific material methodologies and examples ready to use? Yes, Jessica. So just as a final note for this webinar, which I think has been extremely enriching, we will make a summary of the 3 webinars of some of the key points, and that will be shared with everybody. And in this summary, we will try to include as many resources as we can so that this conversation translates into reality, and that your projects, we will start seeing more and more disaster risk reduction projects or programs that successfully have incorporated gender and that successfully have analyzed the impact of doing or of integrating this perspective, and that they can report it very proudly. With this, I would like to thank again our 3 wonderful presenters. And with this, I would thank as well all of the participants for staying in this hour of conversation. As a gender cluster, we are here. We can support you as well, but also we thought it was really important that you see that as an organization, we do have also various experts as well that can provide this support in our colleagues from other agencies or in colleagues even within our organization. So thank you very much, the PECO project, for allowing us this space, and for all the participants for contributing with your questions. Thank you very much. Almudena.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you very much, Maria, Ivan, and Marta. It was a very useful webinar. I think that we learned a lot. And I only say again, thank you. We're going to share the presentation and everything with all of you. We will be in touch, and if someone needs additional information about the documents or regarding the different webinars, the elements that we saw in the different webinars, please let us know. You have my contact there, and we can provide you with our support through UNDP and with the collaboration of all our colleagues. Thank you so much, Andrea, for conducting these webinars, for your experience and your professionalism, and the same to Ivan, Marta, and Maria. Thank you so much to give us your experience and have all the time, to share with all of us your knowledge. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marta.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Thank you for the
Have a great
invitation.
day.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.